G'day, it is Dr. Nerida, embracing all of my Aussiness today and welcoming you back to the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast. In our last episode, we talked about one of the biggest questions on horse owners' minds, and that was how much hay should I feed my horse on a daily basis? And today, what I want to cover is one of the other big questions that horse owners have on their mind, and that is, does my horse need grain? So grains are not naturally found in a horse's diet, and it is one of these areas of nutrition where horse owners can get very confused about whether they should be feeding grain, shouldn't be feeding grain. Is grain good for horses? Is grain bad for horses? And my very short answer to does my horse need grain is no, yes, maybe, and absolutely not. So we cover pretty much every spectrum, and it really does depend on a case-by-case basis for each horse as to whether or not they need grain. It is certainly okay not to feed grain, and it is certainly okay to feed grain when grain feeding is done really well. So why do we feed grain to horses? And there's really only one reason. The only reason we feed grain, and when I say grain, I mean cereal grains. So the starchy cereal grains can include wheat, corn, oats, rice, barley, and lesser used grains like rye and triticale. The only reason we feed those cereal grains in a horse's diet is as a source of energy or calories. So I say this quite often, and apologies if you've heard me say it many times, but energy and calories in a horse's diet are the same thing, and I use the terms interchangeably. But the only reason we feed cereal grains in a horse's diet is to provide energy. And most of the energy found in a cereal grain is contained in the starch. So the starch, if you grab a piece of barley or a piece of wheat and break it open, you'll see white stuff in the middle, and that white stuff in the middle is the starch. And that is really the reason why we are feeding grains to horses, because starch is very high in energy. I'll talk a little bit more about the starch soon, but I want to cover why I guess we all need to be cautious with feeding cereal grains, and why there is so much worry and concern around feeding grains for horses. So there are lots and lots of problems that you can cause with feeding cereal grains in a horse's diet, and therefore to feed cereal grains safely, we have to be aware of all of these problems that grain feeding can cause, so that you can avoid those problems if you do feed cereal grain in your horse's diet. So the first problem that cereal grain feeding can cause is obesity. So many of our horses in the modern world are overweight or obese. A lot of that is just due to the fact that they are doing very little exercise, and the feed that we feed horses these days, including the pastures and the forages, is just a lot better than what they actually need. And so they're burning not very much energy because they're not moving very much, and then they're consuming a lot of energy with high-quality pastures and high-quality hays, and maybe they have grains in their diet as well. But certainly if we are feeding grain unnecessarily to horses that don't need the additional energy in their diet, you are going to cause obesity issues for that horse. There is published research showing that the more grain we feed to a horse, the higher risk of gastric ulcers and also the higher risk of colic. And so we do have to keep that in mind. But probably the biggest issue with feeding cereal grain in horses' diets when it's not done well is that you will put a lot of the starch that the cereal grain contains, so the white stuff in the middle of the grain, you'll put a lot of that into the horse's hindgut. And when you put starch into the horse's hindgut, the bad bacteria, who I describe as the party animal bacteria, they love starch, and they will grab hold of that starch. They will ferment it really, really quickly. Their population explodes in number. They produce excessive amounts of volatile fatty acids and also lactic acid. And they will acidify your horse's hindgut, and then that will lower the pH in the hindgut. And once the pH drops below about pH of 6.2, you will start to shut down and then kill off the good fibre fermenting microbes. So the good fibre fermenting bacteria and fungi will start to die. And if you do that, either by feeding excessive cereal grain or by feeding the wrong type of cereal grain, you will cause a state known as dysbiosis, so an unbalanced hindgut microbe population. And when you do that, you create this whole lot of knock-on effects, negative knock-on effects for your horse. So they will have a loss of immune function to some degree, not complete loss of immune function, but so much of a horse's immune function is in their gut, and it relies on the correct healthy microbes to be in their gut for proper immune function. But if we wipe out the good bacteria and fungi, then you also are going to have a negative impact on immune function. You will affect their behaviour. So there's lots and lots of studies that have been published over the years saying cereal grain causes changes in behaviour. And this change in behaviour has always been spoken about in terms of we add cereal grain to the diet, it increases the energy content of the diet, and then that is what was thought to change the behaviour. What we're now starting to understand really well is a lot of that change in behaviour is probably stemming from this dysbiosis in the hindgut. So the good bacteria and good fungi in the hindgut are responsible for producing hormones and vitamins that are all tied up in your horse's gut-brain axis communication and in your horse's metabolic function, nervous system function. And when we cause that big shift away from the good microbes in the hindgut by feeding cereal grains in the wrong way, you're having these big impacts on behaviour. You'll also get poor performance, partly because you have now shut down the good fibre fermenting bacteria and fungi, and you will have negatively impacted the flow of the beneficial volatile fatty acids flowing from the hindgut into the muscles. And your horse's muscles use those volatile fatty acids to fuel performance. I talked about this in the podcast about the amount of hay a horse needs each day. But when you shut down your good microbes, you're also shutting down one of your horse's really essential sources of muscle fuel. And that has a big negative impact on performance. And you're losing B vitamin production, and B vitamins are absolutely essential for muscle energy generation. So if you create a B vitamin deficiency because you've altered the hindgut microbial population to such an extent that you no longer have proper vitamin production occurring, then you will get a horse that just doesn't perform well because its muscles can't actually generate energy the way they should be able to. And you'll also get issues right down to things like hoof issues. So the bacteria, the good bacteria and fungi in the hindgut produce biotin, and if you feed in a way that you disrupt those good microbes, then you'll also disrupt biotin production, and then you'll get hoof quality issues. There's lots of these negative flow-on effects from causing dysbiosis. You'll also cause, when your horse goes into this state of hindgut starch fermentation, you'll also get leaky gut. So the actual gut wall in the hindgut will become damaged, and then it will allow pathogens and toxins, and if the good bacteria have died, then you will also get the endotoxins that are released when they actually die and break down in the hindgut, and all of that stuff can leak into the body. It's deadly if it happens to really acutely. So, the classic case of the horse or pony breaking into the feed room and eating half a bag of grain-based feed, and then they get this massive starch fermentation in the hindgut, and the acid production is so extreme that the hindgut gut wall breaks down. Lots and lots of endotoxin is released into the horse's body, and it will eventually cause death. But at a less acute scale, you'll get laminitis. So something, and to my knowledge at this point in time, they still don't know exactly what it is that leaks out of the gut, but something leaks out of the gut and messes with the very tightly controlled enzyme system in the hoof that controls the lamellae, so the little fingers in the hoof that hold the hoof wall onto the pedal bone. Causes inflammation of the lamellae, and then they will eventually, if it's severe enough, they will eventually release and allow the pedal bone in the hoof to move in severe cases of laminitis, and that can be caused by excessive grain feeding. And in fact, for a long time, that was how scientifically laminitis would be induced. They would dose the horse with a slurry of corn or wheat and that the starch would travel very quickly to the hindgut and be fermented and cause laminitis in the horses. So there are so many reasons why, as horse owners, we should be cautious about feeding grain. But if it's done well, grain feeding can also be beneficial and very safe. So it just depends, as I said at the beginning, on a horse-by-horse basis, you need to determine whether a horse does need grain or not. Let's look at all the different options. So I said, does your horse need grain? There's no, yes, maybe, and absolutely not. So let's start with the absolutely not situations, because it's important to understand when a horse absolutely must not have any cereal grain. And it's horses that have got any type of insulin dysregulation. So insulin dysregulation just means that when glucose, so let me start at the beginning. So starch, the white stuff in the middle of a grain, is just all glucose molecules bundled up, joined together and then bundled up into the inside of the grain. And when your horse eats cereal grain, that starch is digested in the small intestine, and digestion occurs with enzymes. So the little pairs of scissors that are in the small intestine, they come along and chop the starch up into single glucose pieces, and then glucose is absorbed into the bloodstream. So when that glucose is absorbed into the bloodstream, the pancreas very quickly picks up on the fact that blood glucose levels are rising above where blood glucose levels should be maintained in the blood. And so the pancreas releases insulin, and insulin's job is to travel around the body and say to cells, including the muscle cells, hey, there's too much glucose out here in the blood. Would you open up and let some in? And then the cells get their little GLUT4 transporters to travel up and attach onto the cell, the outside of the cell, and they literally just suck glucose in and take glucose out of the blood, and then they reconstruct it back into what is essentially starch again, but we call it glycogen when it is stored in the muscles. So they join all the glucose molecules back together and create glycogen, and then that glycogen is stored in the muscles, and the muscles will later use that glycogen to fuel exercise. But in insulin dysregulation, it's like the muscle cells don't hear insulin's message. So insulin's there knocking on them saying, hey, there's too much blood glucose out here, but the cells do nothing. They don't send their transporters up to take the glucose in, but all the pancreas sees is that there's still too much glucose. And so the pancreas will keep releasing large amounts of insulin, and then that insulin, we know from some brilliant research done by Australian researchers, damages the hoof and will cause laminitis. And the estimates are that 90% of laminitis cases we see is actually due to this insulin dysregulation and abnormally high levels of insulin circulating after glucose is taken into the bloodstream. So grains are an absolutely must not for these horses with insulin dysregulation, because they will absolutely trigger these abnormally high insulin responses. And in order to avoid laminitis in these horses, we have to avoid any feeds that are going to trigger a really high insulin response. And cereal grains are top of the list when it comes to feeds that will cause really high insulin spikes. So you cannot feed cereal grains to any horse that has any kind of insulin dysregulation. So that includes horses with the PPID, or used to be called Cushing's disease, horses that have metabolic syndrome, and certainly horses that have had in the past or are suspected to be prone to laminitis. So cannot have cereal grains in their diet under any conditions. And you do, as consumers, you need to be so careful, because there is lots of packaging, and I wish there wasn't, but there is. So it's a buyer beware situation. There's lots of packaging that will say grain-free, but when you read the ingredient list, what you'll find is that there will be an ingredient or more than one ingredient sometimes in there that is grain-derived. So I don't understand why, but there is feeds that have been labelled grain-free that are made predominantly from wheat bran or wheat pollard or a mixture of both. And they say grain-free because it doesn't contain any whole cereal grains. But those grain byproducts are still very, very high in starch, and they will absolutely trigger an insulin response. an abnormally high insulin response in any insulin dysregulated horse. So you have to be really careful, read your ingredient list carefully, know for yourself what constitutes a cereal grain and what doesn't, and don't believe packaging that says cereal grain free unless the ingredient list actually confirms for you that it is cereal grain free. So our next group of horses I'll cover is the no horses. So no, they don't need grain. And these are horses that could have grain. It won't make them sick, it won't cause laminitis, but they don't need grain because they're able to maintain their weight on a forage-only diet. And if you can get your horse to maintain weight on a forage-only diet or even forage and fibres, so all of my horses at the moment are on pasture, and then they get a small amount of lucerne or alfalfa per day, and they get some lupins, some sugar beet pulp, and some copper meal. So they're on all fibre diet. There is no cereal grain in any of their feeds at the moment, and they're all doing beautifully. So they can maintain their weight on forages and fibres by themselves. I will just add, it's really, really important to make sure that you are meeting vitamin and mineral requirements. So my horses are all have their diet balanced up either with a balancer pellet or a low-dose vitamin and mineral supplement, because just forage by itself is not going to meet requirements, particularly for minerals like copper and zinc. And depending on how old or young your hay is or what colour your pasture is, if you've got old hay or your horses are on brown pasture, then you'll also need to be adding vitamins to their diet, particularly vitamins A and E, because they disappear out of your horse's hay and also out of their pasture as the hay gets older or as the pasture matures. So you need to balance it up, but you don't need grain. Sometimes horse owners think, I need to feed grain because that's how I add vitamins and minerals to their diet. There is lots and lots of ways to add vitamins and minerals to the diet that don't involve adding additional calories. So use a balancer pellet or use a low-dose vitamin mineral supplement, but don't feel like you have to feed grain. There is no rule to say that horses need grain in their diet. You're not doing the wrong thing by your horse by not feeding grain. And in fact, if you can get away with feeding just a fibre and forage-based diet, that's the way their gut evolved, and that is what will keep their gut their healthiest. So just to recap on that one and to help you with how do you know that your horse doesn't need grain is if they're maintaining good body condition. So if you can see that without adding grain to their diet, they're able to maintain the weight and condition that you want them in, then you don't need to feed grain. So body condition, score them regularly, feel over their neck, run your hand over their ribs, look at them. If they're rugged, get their rugs off often and check their body condition. But if they're holding their condition just fine, just on their pasture or just on their hay, maybe with some fibres added in, then you don't need to feed grain. There are then the maybe horses, so maybe they need some grain and maybe they don't. So one of my horses is in this situation at the moment, and it's right for us in Australia. We're right at the start of spring, so we've come out of our winter. I always find that this time of the year is a little bit tricky because the pastures are just starting to find their feet again after winter. And I always let my horses strip some weight off over winter as well, because I know that come springtime and when the spring grasses really do hit their straps, the horses will put on weight really quickly. But this boy of mine, Poet, he's 22 and he's in the track with the fatties. So he is a really good doer. But his incisors aren't the best. And so when they're sort of relying on their track and the grass is quite short and I'm only giving them small amounts of strip grazing at the moment because I have a worry with laminitis with a couple of them, he does just start to struggle for weight a little bit. And I literally just ran my hands over him about half an hour ago, and his ribs you can't see his ribs, but if he turned, you would be able to see his ribs, but they're right there. You can feel them like you can feel the bones in the back of your hand. So he'd be right on a condition score of 5, which is perfect. And especially for his age, you don't want old horses carrying around too much weight. But if for whatever reason I didn't have good pasture coming on or he didn't start to pick up, I wouldn't immediately reach for grain with him. I would go for giving him more hay and the best quality hay I can find. So if you can, this is where this is a maybe. So if you can, with these horses that are right on the borderline of not quite being able to hold their body weight on a forage and fibre only diet, don't immediately reach for grain. Go for or think about, can I give them access to better quality pasture? Can I give them access to better quality hay? Or can I partly replace some of their hay that they're currently getting with a higher quality hay? So, for example, if they were getting all grassy hays, could you introduce a high quality lucerne or alfalfa hay into their diet to increase the protein level and also increase their energy level? And would that be enough to maintain their weight? Now, if the answer is no to those questions and you, for cost reasons or for supply reasons or any other reason, you can't increase high energy fibres, things like beet pulp or lupin hulls or copper meal in their diet, and oil, you can certainly feed oil to increase their energy intake. But if for any reason grain is the most logical solution for you, then there's situations where it is okay and very feasible to add some grain into the diet. You won't need very much, depending on what the horse is doing. It just needs to be thought through. Don't let it be your reaction to just grab for a grain-based feed. So when I talk about grains, I mean any grain-based pellets or sweet feeds, muesli, open feeds. They're called all sorts of different things all around the world. Don't let it just be your reflex reaction to go and grab for one of those feeds. Have a think through, can I achieve what I want to achieve with their weight using forages and fibres? And if it is more practical, less expensive, easier for whatever reason, or if the horse prefers to eat that type of feed, if they didn't have a great appetite, any of those reasons, then yes, you can certainly feed grain in their diet, and I will talk about how to do that carefully so that you don't cause any of those problems that we talked about at the beginning of the podcast. So that's the must-nots, the no's and the maybes. And then there's the yeses. And there's not, to be honest, there's not too many horses that fall into this yes category. But my experience says, after working with, I don't know how many thousands of racehorses throughout my career, that thoroughbred racehorses do need some degree of cereal grain in their diet. I have tried on a number of occasions with horses that either tied up really badly or had really severe behavioural issues. We have tried to race them on a grain-free diet. And at least on a couple of occasions, we have actually had racehorses win on grain-free diets. But what I find is that it's really hard to get them to turn around and then back up that race performance. And my thinking is that they need quite a lot of muscle glycogen, racehorses, because they do, when they're galloping, they do spend a lot of time in that anaerobic metabolism. So they're burning and generating energy in their muscles without oxygen present. And the only way they can do that is to burn muscle glycogen. And my theory is that if they don't have grain in their diet, they can build up their muscle glycogen stores because their liver can make glucose for them, and there is other pathways to building muscle glycogen, but they can't do it quickly. And I think when we feed them cereal grain in their diet, they're able to just directly break down the starch into glucose, absorb it from their small intestine, and then have their muscles take it in and turn it into glycogen and store it, which gives them a much faster turnaround so that, they can race and then they can train and then they can race again when they've got grain in their diet. The other class of horse that is sometimes very difficult to feed without grain is lactating brood mares, and particularly when you're in drought conditions or there's very poor quality pasture available. So when there's really high quality pasture available, and I have distinct memories of several seasons where we had thoroughbred brood mares just back to balance a pellet and their pasture because the pasture was just such high quality. They didn't need any extra feed. And in fact, I've got one season that's coming to mind where we had a whole lot of foals that were going over at the knee, so getting what's called contracted tendons, where their bones are growing faster than their tendons, and then their knees knuckle over because their tendon ends up shorter than their bone. And it just comes down to the young horses are growing too quickly. And we had these broodmares cut right back to just balance a pellet and their pasture in an attempt to try and reduce their milk production, because they were making so much milk that the foals were growing too quickly. So it's not a hard and fast rule that lactating broodmares need grain. But when you don't have really high quality pasture and they're mares that are producing a lot of milk, and particularly when their foals are a little bit bigger and drinking a lot of milk every day, 1 to 3 months, I guess, is maximum milk production, you do sometimes need to use cereal grain just so that you can meet their requirement for energy. And they have massive requirements, again, for glucose. So it takes a lot of glucose to make milk. And so when you can provide them some of that glucose directly from grain in their diet, it does help them to maintain milk production. So there is some horses that there's definitely it's definitely beneficial, but you can overdo it. So grain feeding always needs to be done really, really carefully. And when I say carefully, there's 2 things that you need to consider to feed grain well. The first is don't feed too much, and the second is make sure you're feeding digestible cereal grains. So we'll cover the amount part of that puzzle first. So in not feeding too much, you're controlling the amount of grain that goes into the gut, and you're minimising the risk of the starch ending up in the hindgut. So if you feed too much cereal grain, it doesn't matter even if it is the right type of cereal grain. If you feed too much, you are going to dump grain, and therefore you're going to dump starch into the hindgut. And once it gets in there, it will start to cause the microbial dysbiosis that we spoke about and all of the negative consequences that come along with that. And you absolutely want to avoid that situation. You cannot dump starch into your horse's hindgut, because it does so much damage. The ideal amount of cereal grain to feed, the ideal amount of cereal grain to feed is none if your horse doesn't need it. So always remember that your horse does not need cereal grain unless you've got a clearly defined reason for feeding cereal grain. You do not need to feed cereal grain in the horse's diet. But if you are feeding grain, my ideal maximum of cereal grain in a horse's diet is 0.5 kilogram per 100 kilograms of body weight. Or if you speak in pounds, it's 0.5 pound per 100 pounds in body weight. So for a 500 kilogram horse, that's 2.5 kilograms of grain or grain-based feed per day. If you speak in pounds, for a 1,100 pound horse, that is 5.5 pounds of grain or grain-based feed per day. So it's a relatively small amount. If you speak in dippers, 2 litre dippers, if you're feeding pellets, it's less than 2 dippers per day. If you're feeding an extruded feed, it's 2.5 to 2 3/4 dippers of grain-based feed per day. So they're small amounts, particularly if you're used to feeding much larger amounts than this. My absolute maximum, absolutely must not go over this amount, is 1 kilogram per 100 kilograms of body weight, which is 5 kilograms per day for a 500 kilogram horse, or 11 pounds for an 1,100 pound horse per day. So as soon as you go over that amount, that is where you have an increased risk of colic, you have an increased risk of gastric ulceration, and you have an increased risk of dumping starch into the hindgut and causing hindgut dysbiosis. And you will negatively affect performance on a lot of fronts if you feed more grain than that. A survey I did back in the early 2000s with thoroughbred trainers in Australia found that the average amount of grain a thoroughbred racehorse gets per day is 7.3 kilograms of grain per day, and that is way too much. And we have really good performance data now from racehorses to show that you will get much better performance when you feed no more than 1 kilo per 100 kilograms of body weight, and then make up the rest of the diet with hay. And to listen to all of the performance benefits of hay, and there's lots and lots of performance benefits, including natural buffering of the muscles, so you get a higher lactic acid threshold when you feed enough hay. You control the amount of grain you feed plenty of hay, and I can guarantee you're going to get better performance out of those horses than if you feed a really high grain diet. So the second piece of the feeding grains well to horses is feed cooked grains. So raw grains are inherently indigestible in the horse's small intestine. And in fact, the focus of my PhD was how do we process cereal grains so that they are actually digestible in a horse's small intestine? Because if you feed uncooked grains, and uncooked grains can be whole, they can be finely ground, they can be crushed, they can be sliced. It's any grain that hasn't undergone some sort of heat treatment that also involves water. They're incredibly indigestible, and in fact, only about 30% of the starch they contain will be digested in the horse's small intestine, and the rest of it will end up being dumped in the hindgut where it ferments and causes acid accumulation and microbial dysbiosis and all of the negative flow-on effects that we've spoken about. So to feed grains safely, and with the exception of oats, you have to feed cooked grains. So my research and the research of many others has found that extruded grains are some of the most digestible along with popped grains. There's not a lot of popped grains. I know there's some in Europe, but there's not a lot of popped grains that are sold into the horse feed market. Extruded grains are quite common. You can also use well steam flaked grains and properly micronized grains. So well steam flaked being that they are exposed to heat and steam for a long enough period of time that they will actually be more digestible than raw grain. And properly micronized meaning that the grains are first wet, so allowed to soak up some water, and then micronized, and the micronizing process then will combine with the water. And all of these cooking processes essentially disrupt the starch in the middle of the grain and break it open and make it much easier for the horse's enzymes in the small intestine to come along and cut that starch up into glucose for absorption. If you are feeding cereal grain, look for cooked cereal grains. Please don't feed raw grains. Some of my research showed that in thoroughbred racehorses, it is the corn that does the most damage. So horses that were eating corn, as the amount of raw corn they were increased, so did the amount of lactic acid in their manure, showing that the starch was ending up in the hindgut and fermenting and being fermented to lactic acid and lots of other volatile fatty acids and causing damage in the hindgut. So please don't feed raw grains. Oats is an exception. And oats is really, really interesting. It can be fed whole or just rolled. It doesn't need to be heat treated to be safe to feed to horses. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The enzymes in the small intestine of starch digesting enzymes in a horse's small intestine are incredibly efficient at digesting oat starch. So part of my research was looking at the comparison between microbial enzymes, so from fungi and bacteria, and the horse's native enzymes that we took from a horse's small intestine. And we were comparing how efficient the different enzymes were at digesting starch. And as a rule, the horse's enzymes were much less efficient at digesting all of the other grains. I think we were looking at barley and corn and rice and triticale, as well as oats. And for all the other grains, the horse's enzymes were less efficient at digesting starch. But for oats, the horse's enzymes were quite a bit more efficient at digesting the oat starch than what the microbial enzymes were, which was really, really interesting. And then there's also published research to show that even when the oat starch does get into the hindgut, it doesn't cause the same level of disruption as something like a wheat starch or a corn starch will cause. So even if some does escape digestion in the small intestine, it doesn't do as much damage in the hindgut. I love oats. I think there's lots of benefits to feeding oats. It's got beautiful fibre, it's got its natural beta-glucans, and the starch is so nice and safe for horses. I do still love steam flaked oats because you will still get an improvement in digestion when the oats are cooked. But if you want to feed an uncooked grain, then oats is really your only option. So a couple of little specific scenarios that you might come across is your horse is losing weight. Does it need grain or does it need more grain than what you're already feeding it? And the answer to that is a big maybe. So I'd be looking at, why is your horse losing weight? And if it's because, if you're in winter and it's very cold and the quality of your pasture or your hay is declining, then they may be losing weight either because they're burning lots more calories trying to stay warm, or because they're eating less calories because the quality of their forage is too low. So as I mentioned with my poet, the first place I'd be looking there is, can I feed more hay? Can I feed a better quality of hay to try and increase their weight without adding grain in? But if you've got a horse that is already on a high quality pasture or really good quality hay, then maybe adding a very digestible grain into that diet would help. I certainly use grain-based feeds when I need to put weight on horses. So for horses that are spelling from racing, or a good example would be my two little paint horses who I got when they were 12 months old. They were very neglected. They'd never, ever been handled. They were absolutely full of worms, and they were, could see all of their ribs and their hip bones sticking out skinny. So they condition score 3 maybe on the Henneke 1 to 9 scale. So they were thin and looked obviously neglected. And I put them on the best quality pasture I had. I made sure that they had access to loosened hay, but I did feed them an extruded feed, probably for, 10 to 12 months, just to help them try and catch up. They had so much growing to do. They were really stunted, and I wanted to help them catch up to where they should have been so that they didn't end up as stunted horses. And in fact, they have grown beautifully. They're my gorgeous, gorgeous girls now. I love them dearly. But they were on grain-based feed for quite a while because I didn't feel like I could achieve what I wanted to achieve with them on a purely forage and fibre-based diet. And their appetites weren't great either when I first got them. So it helped me to get a whole bunch of calories into them. But I made sure that they were on a very digestible feed, so it was extruded, and I was also adding a supplement that had extra digestive enzymes added to it to help them actually digest and break down that grain. So I was, let's say, 98% sure I wasn't dumping any of that starch into the hindgut, and the amount they were being fed was very controlled as well. So they would have been getting maybe a kilo per feed, just over 2 kilos per day for each of them. So you can use grain. It can be a very safe thing to feed. It can be very, very effective for putting weight on horses, but don't reach for it as your very, very first option without thinking through, why is your horse losing weight? Can you achieve what you need to achieve with better forages and fibres? The other little situation I just want to single out here is overweight horses who are lazy and tired. And sometimes cereal grain is looked at for horses as the source of energy. And you might mistakenly think that if you've got an overweight but lazy and tired horse, that adding some cereal grain into that diet is going to give them energy and make them feel less lazy. Probably what's going to happen is the horse will get more overweight and even lazier. And there's a few reasons for that. I mean, it could just be that the horse is a very, very good doer, and if you go and put even more energy into their diet, you're going to make them even more overweight, which will make them probably less likely to want to work. Or the horse might have a form of tying up, like a PSSM type tying up, where if you add cereal grain to their diet, you'll actually make their muscles sore, and then they will feel tired and lazy. And in fact, a lot of horses that I come across that are overweight and also feel tired and lazy, what I will almost always recommend the horse owner does is get them off any cereal grain or cereal grain-based feed, or any feed that's got anything that comes from a cereal grain, and get them onto a very low starch, low sugar diet, and feed them as if they have got the PSSM form of tying up, where to control it, you really have to minimise the amount of starch and sugars in the horse's diet. And then if it is an underlying case of PSSM that is causing them to just be ever so slightly sore in the muscles, that's then making them really reluctant to move and making them feel like they're tired and lazy, often you'll see those horses turn around when we change their diet, and they'll feel better in themselves. Their muscles won't be sore anymore, and then all of a sudden they'll have a lot more go forward. And the other thing with these horses is get them fit, get some weight off them. And if anything, like it's the opposite to adding grain in the diet. You want to take any high energy feed out of their diet. and you want to go the other way with forage. So if you can reduce the forage quality to cut down their calorie intake, they're not feeling tired and lazy because there's not enough energy in their diet. The fact that they're overweight tells you that there is plenty of energy in their diet, and this is why they're overweight. But it might be that they just need fitness, and they might be tired and lazy because they are tired if they're not fit enough to do the work that they do. And could also be an education thing. I certainly had this with my gelding. I had a bad habit that was picked up in a clinic where I just tap constantly on his side, and the clinician picked me up for it and told me to stop doing that. And it was a case for him where, I'd ask him for a canter, he would canter, and then I didn't tap him, I didn't try to keep him going, and then if he dropped back to a trot, that was when there's Justin Cahoon's brilliant clinics, he would say, tell him with certainty now that, no, you didn't ask him to come back to a trot, you ordered him to canter, and that made a massive difference with him going from what felt lazy, because he was hard to keep going all the time, to having a horse that I could put in a certain gait and then he would stay there, and it just all came down to education for him. There's lots that goes into this, isn't there? I think a lot of the time, horse nutrition can be so simple. Feed lots of fibre, don't overfeed grain, make sure that the diet is balanced with vitamins and minerals. But there's all these little nuances that say that, this is okay for this horse but not for that horse, and instead of doing this, maybe you should do that. But I hope what I've just shared with you now helps you figure out whether you should be feeding grain to your horse, whether you can feed grain to your horse, or whether it would be better that you avoid feeding grain to your horse. If your horse does do really well on forage, just remember there is no rule to say that you should be feeding grain in their diet. It is absolutely okay to feed just forages and fibres. Please do make sure that you balance their diet carefully. This is where My Happy Horse comes into its own. It will show you, first of all, it will show you if you're feeding too much grain, and it will also tell you if you're feeding the wrong type of grain. So it will give you a gut health score, and if you are feeding raw cereal grain or too much cereal grain, it'll affect the horse's gut health score in the app. So you'll be able to see that you need to adjust the amount of grain you're feeding because you're feeding too much or you're feeding the wrong type of grain. And it will also make sure that your diet is balanced. So it will give you, if nothing else, peace of mind that you can feed a diet without grain, any kind of fortified feed, but if you've got a balancer pellet or a supplement in there to make sure you're meeting vitamin and mineral requirements, your horse is getting everything it needs and you don't need to feed grain into the diet. But if you do need grain, it's absolutely legitimate to feed grain to horses. They can handle it, and it does benefit some horses. Like I was saying, the thoroughbred race horses and lactating brood mares, when their pasture or forage quality is not great, it can help you to make sure that they are able to maintain condition and maintain performance levels and maintain milk production. So you can feed grain, but just please be careful with the way that you do it, because if you mess grain feeding up, you mess their gut up. And then once you mess their gut up, you are going to have an unhealthy, unhappy horse that will have a plethora of problems that will cost you a fortune to figure out and fix in the long run. And they become, when you overfeed grain and negatively affect their hindgut microbiome, they become just difficult horses. They're not nice horses to be around. Their behaviour changes, and they're unhappy. They really are unhappy horses. So please feed grain carefully. Please think through carefully how you're going to do it. Please use the My Happy Horse app, because it will guide you and make sure that you're not feeding too much grain, you're not feeding the wrong type of grain. And feed lots of forage. I guess is the other piece of that puzzle. And if you can get those two things right, feed lots of forage and be really careful with grain, you are going to have a happy and healthy horse. If you'd like to know more about the My Happy Horse virtual equine nutritionist, you can head on over to myhappy.horse. And also, while you're there, check out the Dr. Nerida AI. which is me in AI format. And that version of me is happy to answer your questions about horse nutrition 24/7. Thanks again, and we'll catch you soon.